So, in this lecture, we're primarily going to go over some of the history in our world and especially in our country, in the United States, on how human experimentation has changed over the years and where we're at today. And at the end of this, I'm going to have you read a couple of different case studies from the last decade or so, because you might think that we've learned from our mistakes back from World War II. But in reality, it took us a long time to fundamentally understand how to implement the ethics behind human experimentation. That's one of the major struggles of biotech today is most of the things that we're trying to do are designed to help humans, right? Whether it's GMOs and we're looking at genetically modifying the food to be able to feed more people, or whether it's actually creating pharmaceuticals or doing various medical related experiments to help with diseases and problems, right? And trying to, even something as simple as a vaccination, it comes down to human experimentation. And so, it's all great and good if you want to work on animals and microorganisms and do these things in theory. But in reality, when it comes down to the pharmaceuticals, the medicines, the practice, you ultimately have to do some type of human experimentation. So the big question becomes, who gets to say what is, something that does or doesn't go against our morals or ethics as a society? Because you look at different societies and you determine, well, different people have different set of rules on what is ethical or what is moral to do. And so this is a very difficult part of biotech today, because most of the things that we do in biotech are ultimately designed to help the human condition. But a big part of that is the actual experimentation on humans to see if the drug works, or see if the vaccine works, or see if the gene therapy works. And there's a lot of problems that arise from that, and a lot of regulations and laws that, especially here in the U.S., we've adopted. So as I go through this is going to be a big part of not only the write-up that you're going to do for some of the case studies that we're going to give you to read and discuss and formulate your opinions on, but will also be part of a lot of the final quiz that you're going to be given, final exam number 4, for this class. So let's begin. Everybody has heard of the Hippocratic Oath, and this basically was, people know like one line from it, do no harm. But there's a lot more to it than just do no harm. And if you read through all of it, there's quite a bit going on here. And I'm not going to have you know or memorize everything from the Hippocratic Oath. But fundamentally, this was taken by doctors to limit the amount of damage that was done while they were trying to help people, right? And so this is basically a code of ethics, is the Hippocratic Oath, to do the best you can to not hurt the individual, to benefit them. And so as you read through these, again, these are just kind of a modern day list of things that are supposed to be used when doctors or even scientists and researchers are designed to implement many of the things that we've come up with. But in the early 19th and 20th century, we found that most of the advancements were coming out of Germany and France, and these are where people were actually practicing many of these experiments and trying to test and advance medicine. The problem became when, proper methods weren't being used to protect the health and safety of the individuals. And ultimately, even when we do our best, there's almost always problems that arise. One of these conditions that happened was there was this drug that went up the line from stem cells to animals and eventually into people, and it was being used to treat rheumatoid arthritis and MS. And it basically passed all of the checks. It went through the cells, it went through the mice, rats, whatever you say with that. And then the human cells, all of it passed. But what ended up happening was when they started testing humans, they all of a sudden had what we call a cytokine storm. And there were a lot of reasons on why this ultimately happened. But it was not being tested for in all of these other things. You just couldn't replicate what was happening in the actual human cells. And because it unleashed this huge cascade of chemicals, basically it sent them to the hospital and did some permanent damage to a lot of these people. So this cytokine storm, this trial became known as the Elephant Man trial because one guy's head swelled up so much that basically referred to it as an elephant. And this is the guy here that had the problem, and you can see that there was some permanent damage done to his fingers because of the cytokine storm that happened through this process. And fundamentally, what we learned from this was you can try to replicate these processes, these biological processes, the best you can in lab mice and in primates and in human cell lines. But fundamentally, there was a missing element of a protein that they didn't make that we do. And because of that protein that we make, this is what caused the cytokine storm. And so had any of these other previous tests had any, of this protein, we would have seen that this would have had an adverse reaction, but it never showed up in all of the others. So the scientists did the best that they could, but they ultimately had this huge failure in the human experimentation trial. So obviously, whether you're intending to do harm or not intending to do harm, there's generally some harm done in the human experimentation process. Now, obviously, when we talk about Nazi doctors, generally you find that they were doing human experimentation with no bounds, no ethics, no morals, no, is this going to hurt them? They were just doing human experimentation without limits. And obviously, most people would agree that this is something we wouldn't want to do, right? You wouldn't do these experiments without making sure that there were protections and all of that, but none of that. And that's why we really use these as examples of what happens when there are no rules, when there are no regulations of ethics and morals, and what happened. I mean, they were doing mass sterilization techniques. They were basically saying, can we sterilize people? Yep, here we go. Or can we infect them with something and then see if we can cure them of that, right? Things that you wouldn't even imagine we would still do today. But you might be surprised because there are some things still done today in the name of science that people justify because the outcomes can be so beneficial for man. And the big question becomes, how do you weigh that cost? How do you weigh the cost of, is it beneficial or is it going to do harm to the individual? And that's one of the biggest problems with the laws that we use to determine the ethics and morals of human experimentation. Now, after the World War II, we basically had what were called the Nuremberg Trials. And the Nuremberg Trials were essentially a series of trials that put the doctors and the judges and all of the supervisors and everybody else, hold them accountable. These were basically military trials, military tribunals that were to hold them accountable for all of these travesties that were done during World War II. And so from the Nuremberg trials, these were a lot of the doctors that were put on trial, we came up with what we call the Nuremberg Code. And this was our modern day ethics and morals, right? This is our way of saying, look, it improved upon the Hippocratic Oath of ethics that said we should do no harm to these individuals, and that this is how we should proceed forward to do human experimentation, to do human trials and testing scientific hypotheses. The problem was, even though everyone's like, yeah, that's great, awesome, let's do it, they came up with the Nuremberg Code, nobody put it into law. So it basically was this code of ethics and morals that most people never adopted, not even here in the United States. So it was great that they came up with what we should do, but then it wasn't until like 20 years later that someone said, hey, we're not following this because there's no punishment if you don't follow this. There's no law saying you must follow this and here are the regulations. So what did the United States do? We adopted it and we created what we call the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 45, Volume 46, or shorthand CFR Title 45, Volume 46. That's the law. That's the Nuremberg Code law. So make sure, especially for the exam, that you know that the Nuremberg Code was the code of ethics that came about from the Nuremberg Trials, but it was not law, right? It was international code, but each country had to decide whether or not they wanted to put it into law. Here in the U.S., we put it on the books. That's what CFR Title 45, Volume 46 is. They are the principles of the Nuremberg Code put into law. And you might think, great, we got it into law, everything's going to be covered. No. In reality, it took a longer time even after that, because even though it was in law, people didn't know how to follow the law. They didn't know how to implement the rules. So even though there was punishments for these laws for not following them, nobody had a clear guideline on how to implement them. These were the principles of the Nuremberg Code. And you don't have to know all of these, but some of the most important ones are things like voluntary consent, where the human subject was entirely able to opt in and opt out. Now, that is a big, tall order, because in order to opt in and opt out, you have to have a lot of information. We call it informed consent. You need to know what the pros and the cons and the benefits and the downfalls. You even need to know what the chances for you to get better are if you don't undergo the trial. See, sometimes people would not inform them of alternative methods that were available. You're going to see that in the Tuskegee Syphilis trial. That was one of the tragedies of the during this time, where people were still doing research and not ultimately implementing the law because they weren't telling them of new therapies, because it would have ruined their current research. So they didn't inform them of the newest therapies that they could have taken, and it would have completely destroyed their research. And that's why it became very difficult, because you'd have the scientists that were kind of controlling the funding, controlling the flow of the research, and in some cases they weren't informing those that were partaking of it. So you don't really have voluntary consent if you're not informed. That was one of the biggest principles of the Nuremberg Code. Now, obviously, other things were things like not having it be random. You can't just say, well, let's just see what this does. You can't do that. It must have an absolute benefit for society before you can even proceed, right? You obviously got to have animal experimentation to preempt that. And like I said, even when you have that, sometimes you still have problems when it gets to human experimentation. You got to avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering. Now, that sometimes there's going to be some suffering, and that's part of the informed consent. That's part of the, look, when you take this, there are going to be side effects. It might help you, but there may be side effects as a result of that. And so you have to kind of plan for what happens, both knowing and unknowing. So a lot of times these clinical trials are done obviously in a hospital, so that if there's unintentional physical or mental suffering, you can take care of it right away. But these are all things that are kind of put into the research and all of that. Obviously, if you know that there is a possibility of death or major disability, you're done. You're done. You're not even going to go forward with it, because you got to. That's just completely out of that. There is going to be risk. You definitely have to weigh the risk to the benefit. And when we sum this up, we call it beneficence. Basically, what is the risk to benefit ratio? And the higher risk, the higher benefit needs to happen. If it's a high risk, low benefit, it usually doesn't happen because it doesn't pass muster. You got to weigh the humanitarian importance to the risk to make sure that it's worth that risk. Obviously, you got to prepare, do a lot of preparing. This comes into the avoiding unnecessary physical and mental anguish. You got to have people that are competent doing it. You also have to have oversight, Because if you don't, this was what was going wrong with the scientists back in the day, is they were the ones controlling the flow of the experiment. Today, it's not the scientists controlling the flow. It's a group above them that can say, nope, nope, I don't like the data. I don't like what you're doing. You're done. Because there's a conflict of interest if you have the scientists doing the experiment also controlling when the experiment moves forward and all of that. And we're going to talk about the IRBs and things of that sort. So there must be people in charge that can terminate it at any stage, especially when the people themselves, when they get data and say, no, we shouldn't go forward with this. So with informed consent, this is one of the most important things about the way to implement the Nuremberg Code or the CFR Title 45, Volume 46 code law in the U.S., is you had to make sure that the people weren't coerced, right? You can't say, well, just keep doing this for a while and I'm sure it'll get better. No, they have to be fully free without any type of repercussions of say, I'm done. I'm not in this anymore. There has to be no coercion. They have to be capable of understanding. This is a hard one because what happens when you get into children where they don't have a lot of ability to understand all of the pros and cons of what's going on? They kind of in their own protected category. What about pregnant women where the child that is unborn has no capability? That's a can of worms. That's essentially a big thing that has been controversial for a long time now. What about prisoners who ultimately are in the prison facility but want to maybe benefit and be, part of these drug trials or whatnot, especially when you give incentives? The big question is, what's the difference between incentives and coercion? Because if you say, hey, I'll give you, shorter prison sentence if you take part of this drug trial, they'll be like, sure. Well, is that coercion or is that incentivization? That's a gray area because it feels like, hey, I'm getting something, you're getting something, but it's really hard to be able to kind of figure out the difference between coercion and incentivization, especially when you get into things where someone says, hey, you can come to this school, but you got to take part of this procedure. That's one of the case studies you're going to kind of see was in this school, people weren't being allowed in unless they participated in a certain case study. And so it's kind of like, hey, you want to enter in here? Here you go. So that's a really difficult one to deal with. Obviously, others are pretty easy, giving them knowledge to understand the nature, the risks, the benefits, alternatives, also the risk of benefits of not only the alternative treatments, but not receiving the treatment, saying you may get better without this, right? You may not have to do this, because a lot of times this is something that scientists don't want to tell them. They're like, no, I want you to take part of this treatment. They're like, well, here's the risk and benefits of not receiving it, right? So there's a lot that goes into informed consent. Now, again, Nuremberg Code, Code of Ethics, not law, right? CFR, Title 45, Volume 46, that's the law. But the big question is, how do you implement it? How do you enforce it? And so this is where we had to create what are called IRBs, Internal Review Boards. These are part of how we figured out how to get everyone to follow the law and implement that. Now, here are some of the case studies. You're not going to read all of these. Some of these you are, but here was one where basically in the Willowbrook State School, they essentially justified the basis of allowing people to, be infected with this in the basis that it was going to happen. So they might as well, infect them with it because based upon, their group or their race or other things that they were going to get the infection. And in some cases, people were not able to get into the school unless they agreed to participate in this. Again, that was the is it coercion, right? And that was 1956. This is right after World War II, not too far along. We'd already adopted the Nuremberg Code, but again, people weren't following it during this period of time. There were other case studies where the Department of Defense did irradiation and plutonium injections into people. I mean, you would think that we weren't as bad as the Nazi doctors, but we were. You know, there were scientists even here in the U.S. that were doing things that were just as tragic as what they were doing in Germany. Tuskegee syphilis trial. This is one you're going to read about. This was a horrible one because it lasted so long, 1928 to 1972. Right? Huge study. Even after penicillin was available, they didn't tell them of the treatment to get rid of the syphilis. They kept using the previous ones because they didn't want to mess up the study. These were like long-term studies. This is the problem you get into when you have scientists controlling the studies. There was a lot of coercion going on. There was a lot of distrust. It wasn't until somebody blew the whistle and news came out of that they finally had to end the study in 1972. This was a huge issue. And this kind of opened people's eyes to the problem that we still had in the U.S., where we had the Nuremberg Code, but we really hadn't put it into law. So they created the law, but again, they had the problem of how do we implement the law, right? We had it on the books, but it was difficult. So what they do in 1979, okay, they created what's called the Belmont Report. This is an important part for your exam. I'm going to test you on the Belmont Report. This was the report to basically say, hey, here's how you implement the law. It was a guideline for how to do so. And one of the key things of the Belmont Report was the institutional review boards, the IRBs. These were the people that basically made sure that all of the ethics and morals of the Nuremberg Code were being implemented. And these are kind of the three major principles of this process outlined by the Belmont Report: autonomy, beneficence, and justice. And these are also things I'm going to test you on the exam for. So let's talk about them. Autonomy. That's the informed consent part. Each person has the ability to opt in, opt out. They're given the protection, especially if they're vulnerable, such as children, elderly, mentally ill, prisoners, and of course unborn children as well got included. You get these new subsections that come into law as well from this. So autonomy, that the individuals have the respect, the time, and opportunity to make their own decisions. They have the ability to opt in and opt out. The scientists cannot coerce, cannot persuade or pressure the individuals to participate, to stay in. This was one of the biggest problems of human experimentation back in the day, was the coercion that was going on and the lack of informed consent. Now, another thing that you won't even get off the ground unless you secure the well-being of all the participants. This is part of the way that we make sure that the risk of what is going forward equals the benefit to society. This is why we call it beneficence, is basically, are the benefits of society outweigh the risk, right? High risk needs to have high benefit. High risk cannot have low benefit to society, right? So you got to weigh the possibilities between these and make sure that you do everything possible to maximize the benefits and minimize the harm. And then finally is justice. Now you may think, what is justice? Well, again, this is the punishment. This is the law that raises the question, before we even get started, who bears the risk of the study? Who bears the financial risk? Who bears the human suffering risk? And who benefits, right? Like a pharmaceutical, does everyone benefit? Is it only made available to those who have thousands of dollars? Or is it something that can be beneficial to everybody? In fact, the FDA has actually nixed several cancer drugs because the pharmaceuticals that came out with them weren't willing to lower the price to make it available even through insurance for a lot of cancer patients. And so they went through the whole process, and here in the end, because they said, no, this needs to be beneficial to everybody, they basically said, nope, We don't approve it. The FDA just shut that down. And so there are cases where people can go through this whole thing, but if they don't show that it can actually be received by those that need it, there can be things that come into play, especially legally, that can shut things down. So who bears the risk of the study financially and whatnot? Who also receives its benefits? That's the justice. So make sure you know these three concepts, because that's going to show up on the exam. Okay, so moving forward again, we've already talked a little bit about the protected class, pregnant women, prisoners, children. These are subparts that have been added. The law keeps being added to because people keep coming up with different questions that haven't been addressed when the original law was put into place. But this is the original law, and then the subparts got put into place too. So the biggest question becomes, if you're getting your funding from a private source, do you still have to have an IRB? And we'll talk about that in just a second. Again, IRB is required for all human experimentation. In fact, if you ever see someone doing some research at an institution and they don't say on the bottom of it what the IRB is, then there's a problem, because that needs to go on like their, hey, here we're doing this trial and here's our IRB number. Like, you have to have that already in place before you can even move forward with the human experimentation, to ensure that you have oversight on your research. And so that's essentially what the IRB is any institution, private or public, has to have an IRB so that they can determine what activities constitute part of the research. They're the ones that give that stamp of approval or disapproval on all activities. They make sure that you're following the law. They get updated regularly. And they're the ones that came in and say, hey, no, you're not doing it according to as you're supposed to. You're done. They have the legal power to essentially shut you down because they say, you're not giving us the data, or you're fudging the data, or the data shows us that this is an unacceptable risk. You're done. And so that's one of the reasons why the IRB is so important when it comes to implementing the law. And so, again, if you're a private researcher and you don't get money from the feds, are you exempt from oversight? The answer is no. You must have an IRB. You must have oversight. You're still subject to the law even if you use private funding. So it doesn't matter whether you're a private pharmaceutical company or a public academic research institution doing that, or a medical facility or whatnot. You gotta have your IRB. Doesn't matter where you're getting your money from or what type of institution you are. Here in the U.S., that is the law. Okay. Now, it is up to each company to make sure that they're in compliance with the law. And that's when you usually get your lawyers, because the regulations that go into this for the industry and the standards that you have to follow are huge. And that's one of the next things we're going to talk about in the next lecture, is on how do you use good manufacturing practices and other things to comply with the law.